Resident Evil 4 Remake has taken a game that pioneered an entire genre of gaming and updated it with modern design standards that round out the edges of what may have once been a bit clunky or awkward. To begin with, the game does an excellent job guiding the player by virtue of drawing their attention with things in the environment. In particular, the game is extraordinarily consistent with its usage of one simple yet very specific thing to that end: the color yellow. Almost everything of importance that can be interacted with bears the mark of this color, and that will be expanded on more in the visual design segment. Very rarely does the game ever feel tedious or boring, in spite of the fact that about half of the game is essentially an escort mission. Encounters and puzzles are spaced out in such a way that the player is almost always doing something, and even in the interim, there's very often things to loot or grind for your benefit. And on the topic of grinding, the game has a huge amount of challenges to work towards and things to unlock, with a plethora of extras that are unlocked as a result of the things that you accomplish in the game. It's thanks to this, and the fact that the game also launched with New Game Plus, that the game also has a great deal of replayability. Although, while the game is rarely tedious, it can become frustrating at times. There are several instances of encounters, be it with a particular enemy or an angry mob, where it isn't entirely clear how exactly the player is meant to progress. In reality, many of these have multiple win conditions, but ultimately almost all of them are timed encounters which will end automatically after a set period is passed, provided that none of the other conditions have been met. Unfortunately, this can lead to the player losing valuable resources that didn't need to be spent, or feeling as though their health is just being stolen sometimes for no reason. With that being said, the game is also unique in that, much like the original, it doesn't take itself too seriously most of the time. When it isn't trying to make the player feel deliberately uneasy, it isn't afraid to have that arcadey video game feel that's been lost in recent years. Examples of which are key items simply floating into place rather than having a fully animated cutscene of the player using them, or the fight with Del Lago, where Leon can take a single harpoon and make it into infinite harpoons. Until he wins, at which point it's revealed that you just made it, and all along, he was on his last harpoon. The world of Resident Evil 4 takes a departure from the middle American cities of the previous games and sets itself in rural Spain. In doing so, the game has also divided itself into 3 dedicated sections, which essentially function as 3 different major levels. The village takes up the first third of the game, and is broken into the main village itself, the joint fish farm and quarry, and the lake, which serves to connect a large portion of the map. The castle takes up the second third, and is dominated by Castle Salazar. The castle being divided into many more sub-portions than the village, including a dungeon, a library, a hedge maze/courtyard, the water room, and of course, the clock tower, among many others. Also, in a rather foreshadowing piece of level-based world building, there is also an underground laboratory equipped for extreme cold, something which will be explained later. The final third of the game is the island, which you would be safe to assume is an island off the coast of Spain. The island is heavily fortified and is used as both the central hub for biological research and as a manufacturing depot for anything that the Los Iluminados cult needs. Contrary to the many areas of the previous 2, the island is divided into 3 much larger areas for the most part. The factory and all the defensive measures leading to it, the laboratories, many of which use cryogenic cooling technologies to keep certain Las Plagas projects in stasis, and the ruins, which contain the biggest deposits of excavated Las Plagas parasites, and is considered the Los Iluminados holy site. A parallel can be drawn between the labs under the castle and the labs on the island, seeing as the castle labs were equipped with rudimentary liquid nitrogen cooling systems, and Los Iluminados first began to flourish thanks to a partnership between the head of the royal family and the leader of the cult. It makes sense that the first research lab on Las Plagas was originally staged beneath the castle. However, with the remnants of Umbrella along with Major Krauser, Los Iluminados converted a nearby island into their dedicated research facility with much more advanced technology, and proceeded to defend it viciously. Although rare, the game can sometimes struggle with significant bugs. The one I want to touch on here is an issue with enemy pathfinding, specifically with enemies that have a unique way of getting around. There were circumstances where a novistador had landed and didn't know how to get back into the air from where it was in order to come and kill me. So it would just run into a ledge forever, and much more significantly, there was an issue with the first Garrador mini-boss fight. The Garrador is blind and charges Leon based upon sound. The arena is a small room with chains dangling from the ceiling, which will make noise if touched. To get out, you need to crank the door open while making constant noise, which means that realistically, you're going to be forced to kill the Garrador in order to proceed. However, a bug occurred wherein it heard a noise from inside of a wall and ran into a corner forever. It didn't even matter if I made noise, since it seems as though its programming demands that it reaches the source of one sound before responding to another. This meant that I managed to leave without ever needing to fight it, which ruined the encounter. On the far more minor end, Ashley and Leon will both sometimes have broken dialogue, where their mouths will move and the dialogue subtitles will be shown, but there will be no audio played. This is obviously much less significant than something that'll actually be affecting gameplay, but it is still noticeable enough to be worth mentioning. Hey there, thanks for not just skipping to the end. Since you're here, subscribe to enable my crippling yellow herb addiction, and of course, beware spoilers from this point forward. Following the Raccoon City incident from Resident Evils 1 through 3, Leon Kennedy is asked to take a promotion from police officer to Secret Service agent, thanks to his knowledge and experience in dealing with the bioweapons produced by Umbrella. When the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, is abducted and taken to a remote region of rural Spain, Leon is dispatched along with local law enforcement before, in his own words,
"Things went to shit."
He uncovers a plan to control the world's population using Las Plagas, a parasite with mutagenic hive mind properties. Ashley's abduction was set into motion by the paramilitary called Los Iluminados, with the intent of sending a now-infected Ashley back to America in order to spark an international incident and control the White House. The cult was brought about by Osmond Sadler by way of manipulating the corrupt current head of the Salazar royal family, Ramon, into uncovering the secret that his family had kept buried for years, the aforementioned Las Plagas. All of this being assisted by Major Krauser, a former member of the US Special Forces and a military mentor to Leon, who helped to accelerate the technological advancement of the cult and provided defenses for the Las Plagas research labs. Before he can return to America with Ashley, Leon needs to find a way to cure her and to prevent Las Plagas from ever getting out again. Until the next game. It's the boulder punchy one. What's interesting is that for something that is clearly meant to be campy and overly complicated set dressing for horror to happen, the characters involved have a surprising amount of depth to them. Even the most black and white of villains with the most stereotypical motivations, I want power and I want to take over the world, both have nuance that leads a layer deeper. Krauser is a betrayed and disowned American soldier who feels as though that not only he, but all of the men he had served with, even including Leon, had been abandoned by the country that they'd sworn their lives to defend. Thanks to a combination of how he's processed these traumas of war, along with the betrayal of his country, it only deepened his bloodthirsty nature and has driven him to pursue raw, unadulterated power. But in the pursuance of that power, he's tragically lost sight of why he fights at all. Reading the various journals around his camp reveals the dark secrets of Operation Javier and how he laments the loss of his men. But when Leon confronts him in the present day, he insists that it's not about revenge, but simply about acquiring more power for power's sake. A power which, despite believing he's attained, he doesn't even have the insight to realize isn't his. It's Sadler's. Also, while it should be noted that Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles paints a much different picture for Krauser, this is the perception that Resident Evil 4 Remake gives the character. Osmond Sadler is in the possession, or rather the infestation, of the dominant Plaga parasite, one which can communicate and dominate all other forms of Las Plagas. Sadler has held the reins from the very beginning, and either as a result of that or the delusions brought on by the Plaga within, he seems to genuinely believe that what he is doing is for the benefit of all. His boss dialogue implies that not only does he unironically view himself as the voice of God, but he also genuinely is confused as to why anyone would ever refuse the euphoria and relief that comes from the submission of one's free will. Luis, a former Umbrella researcher who assisted in the development of the Las Plagas subspecies, even seems to acknowledge this euphoria, but fully rejects the notion on the understanding that the cult still doesn't treat its own people well. Despite the actual possibility of having created a unifying world peace, Luis recognizes that the utopia he'd potentially helped to create isn't one worth living in. Resident Evil 4 was one of the very first pioneers of third-person shooters, even before the likes of Gears of War, and as such, the mechanical gameplay is reasonably basic, although the remake does add some additional mechanics for better and worse, which we'll unpack over the next couple of minutes. Leon controls very smoothly, and while not having the ability to jump, he can vault over any waist-high obstacle like fences or windows, and can hop down from most ledges as long as there's something reasonable to land on. Beyond that, he can shoot and stab. But the depth comes from his interactions with the enemies specifically. If Leon manages to stagger an enemy, he has a window to do a melee attack and put them on the ground. The melee attack does a fair amount of damage, and guarantees that you can essentially follow up with multiple additional shots for free, as a result of landing your shots well to stagger them in the first place. He can also stab enemies from behind for a stealthy insta-kill that doesn't alert nearby enemies, stab those that have been knocked down that have begun transforming, and stab enemies that have managed to grab him, which both breaks him free and deals damage at the same time. In addition to all of these uses for the knife, Leon's knife skills are at the forefront of the remake with the advent of the parry mechanic, allowing Leon to use his knife to parry most non-massive attacks, which sometimes may lead to a stagger and melee situation in and of itself. All of these uses for the knife have come at a new cost, however: the ever-dreaded weapon degradation. Your combat knife will eventually become dull and break with time, and will need to be repaired at the merchant for a fee. This is, however, compensated for with the various new knife items which can be found in the open world as loot. When your main knife breaks, Leon will automatically draw a spare as long as you have one in your inventory, although these often don't deal as much damage and will break much more quickly. These additional knife items also lead to the other new tool at Leon's disposal, the bolt thrower. The bolt thrower uses bolts crafted from spare knives as silent recoverable projectiles. This both ensures that stealth isn't a meaningless exercise anymore that's just guaranteed to be broken the moment you're forced to use a gun, and provides an alternative that, by virtue of the ammo being reusable, allows the player to conserve ammo for the battles that genuinely need it. Ashley also seems to have been cleaned up to a degree that makes her less, how to put this gently, obnoxiously useless. She no longer has a health bar to worry about and will simply go into a down state after taking too much damage. She can now be given orders by Leon to either be evasive and run or hold tight and stay behind him. And when you tell her to hide in a locker for a big fight, she actually stays there most of the time. Hallelujah! But for those worried that too much has changed, the RPG is still a ridiculously expensive one-off insta-kill or phase change for a boss, and the exposed Plaga mutations still have a weakness to flashbangs. As previously stated in the game design segment, the game uses the color yellow in order to guide the player throughout the game, and I want to expand on that here. Barrels and boxes are some of the earliest examples you're going to find, but the earliest example of this practice being used to condition the player to look for the color is in the very first house. Through the cracks around the front door, you'll notice the yellow flickering light of a lantern, and this isn't an accident, as shortly thereafter, the same kind of yellow light will draw your eye to a crack in the wall, allowing you to get a free shot on the enemy inside. It's only after these happen that the player is then introduced to the yellow paint on the barrels. This visual design choice then continues to diversify in terms of the ways that it can appear, but always results in the same goal: drawing the player's attention towards something important. After the barrels and boxes, there are bookshelves used to block doors and windows in certain homes. After the bookshelves, the player is introduced to improvised trip mines haphazardly strapped to whatever they'll fit on using yellow duct tape. Even the old metal windmill uses yellow paint because you're supposed to notice the treasure attached to it. On and on and on this conditioning goes until you get to the point where, when you enter this area in the late game, you already know what's about to be important just from looking around. Generically speaking, from here on, the visuals are improved as one would expect from an update that's 21 years newer than the original. Ashley's model, Ada's model, the Verdugo, the Garrador, all of them look fantastic. Unfortunately, however, the improvements seem to sine wave up and down a bit. One such victim of these downturns, tragically, seems to be Leon, of all characters, who has an unmoving brow chiseled out of stone that permanently has him set to annoyed. After paying closer attention, it seems like very few characters in the game actually utilize their eyebrows in animating their expressions, with the best example arguably being Louise. However, most characters will have their brows in a relatively neutral position, allowing the mouth and eyes to do all of the emoting for them. But with Leon, He's always expressing this serious Neanderthalic scowl no matter what emotion he's feeling or expressing, and so many of his complaints and quips come off as him simply being over everything rather than actually being cool. On the sound design side of characters, Leon does great, although even better are Louise, Ashley, Salazar, and surprisingly, Krauser. With Louise and Salazar, their voice lines certainly express the biggest personalities in the game, with Louise constantly trying to be suave and cool, but constantly coming off as though he's hiding something until much later in the game, and Salazar trying to be composed and diplomatic, whilst always on the verge of exploding with childish, self-important rage. And most surprisingly, I want to play you this clip from Krauser. For my metal friends, pay close attention to how he says the word writhe. Yeah, so Krauser's voice actor isn't just chewing gravel for all of his lines, he threw in an actual fry scream, just for flavor. Contrasting all of these performances is unfortunately Ada, who is as monotone as possible for as much of the game as possible. Even her exerting effort sounds as though she's not giving any effort at all.
Use this!
Instead of coming off as sexy, mysterious, and in control, she just sort of comes off as aloof and unfortunately boring. What is absolutely not boring, however, is the soundtrack, with epic renditions of the original score along with new music that clearly pulled some of the Capcom staff off of Monster Hunter. Seriously, listen to Krauser's theme and then any Monster Hunter fans tell me that doesn't sound like it came from Monster Hunter World. The boss themes in particular shine, as their compositions on their own can tell you all that you need to know about a character. Salazar's theme is a standout example, as the wailing choir and deep, heavy strings open the song on the note of his corruption, with progressions ending in minor keys to deliberately darken and unsettle the tone of the music in the face of the creature that he's become. All before being swept away with floating, regal sounds of a harp and trailing horns as the royal prince swings effortlessly through the air in pursuit of the ingrate peasant who dared to take away what was so obviously his. I really enjoyed going back and playing Resident Evil 4 again, and honestly, I enjoyed it a lot more now than I remember enjoying the original back then. What's been fun is seeing everyone's reaction and comparison to things that are different now between this game and the original, and essentially relearning what the original was like by proxy after all this time. I'm also finding that the more games I review, the more I'm comfortable using a guide if I get stuck or just something doesn't seem right. It saves so much time and headache. For example, this was a big one. I wasn't sure that the Verdugo was killable without an RPG. I dumped around 40 rounds of my fully upgraded Punisher and 10 bolts into his face, and I had no indication of whether or not he was even hurt. Then the elevator showed up, and I wasn't sure if that was because of the amount of damage I had dealt to him, or if it was purely timed, or whatever, but it turns out it's both. The elevator will always show up on a set timer, but you can also kill the Verdugo using the RPG, Magnum, or a crap ton of rifle and shotgun ammo. So upon reading that, I reloaded my save, parried my life out, and saved 50 rounds. There were a couple situations like that. Those aside though, I'd say my opinion score is probably a 9 out of 10. It's a very solid game all around. Having just reviewed Dead Space Remake before this, it's pretty clear how Dead Space stands on the shoulders of what Resident Evil 4 and later Gears of War had built, and to this game's credit, a lot of games that made me feel tense or on edge or paranoid, but very rarely does an action horror game make me feel genuine, unapologetic fear, especially if I know something is coming. So with that said, the Regeneradores can all die in a fire. The music in the lab is by far the creepiest in the game. They make you turn the lights off again. Their quivering, heavy breathing emanating from the darkness sounds like if you tried to quietly laugh under your breath after you just sprinted a mile. And the fact that the remake version has their maw smiling at you makes it so much worse. And all of this is on top of the fact that they are stupidly hard to kill without a lot of rifle or submachine gun ammo, because those are the only things you can attach the stupid scope to. I spent the entire game running away and kiting enemies around, but these guys are the first and only time I just ran away. But enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? So, how long do you think we have to wait for a Silent Hill remake? The Resident Evil and Dead Space remakes have both been bangers, so who knows, maybe Konami will notice. But while we wait, all I ask is that you subscribe if you want more reviews like this one and help me do this for a living. And until then, I've been Lone Wolf EX, and I will see you, yes you, next time.